EA Sports. It's in the game. All right, let's go ahead and get to it. From the EPR Creations studio, this is Jason Staples bringing you the Unconquered podcast, or Unconquered with Doc Staples if you prefer that name. So, as always, this podcast brought to you by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price. And Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Starting to be a pretty good time to buy. And if you are in one of those states, give Justin Galloway a call, and he will make sure that you get the absolute best in service. He'll hook you up, y'all. Give him a holler. Let him know you heard about him from Unconquered. All right, well, time to move over to the defensive side of the ball. There's a whole lot to discuss in terms of the personnel, as always the case. What I'm doing when I do this is, first of all, we're talking about what Florida State was last year. We're talking about what they're bringing back, and then we're going to try to assess the difference in terms of what can be expected based on the overall composition this year. So we're going to go ahead and start here with the linebacking core. And this is an interesting one to project because there's been a whole lot of change at that position. Last year, FSU probably had the second best, either the second or the third best pair of linebackers in the ACC. I think Clemson's pair was, by a good margin, the best pair of backers in the ACC, and they still returned Barrett Carter, who I really wish had gone pro. He was, in my view, Barrett Carter was the best linebacker I saw play all last year, and he's back. But they had two really good ones, and then North Carolina was in the mix as well with Cedric Gray and Power Eccles. After that, you had Florida State, and FSU. You could make a case for above, say, North Carolina, not over Clemson, but Florida State's pair, Kalen DeLoach and Tatum Bethune, their primary pair there, they were as good as anybody in the conference. And one other thing that Florida State was able to do a good bit last year is rotate at that position. And this is going to be a big theme of our breakdowns of our personnel discussion coming into this on the defensive side of the ball coming into this season, is looking at how good a job Florida State did of load management last year. And that's one thing that you look at the entire front seven, or front six really, in Florida State's scheme. That entire front six rotated a ton of bodies, and they rotated them in every game, not just in the games that were blowouts. They rotated a bunch. I mean, looking at snap counts, Kalen DeLoach, 563 snaps. Tatum Bethune, 489 snaps. DJ Lundy, 403 snaps. That's three backers with over 400 snaps and none with over 563. Omar Graham, 268 snaps. Go down the list a little further. Blake Nicholson, 101 snaps. Justin Cryer, 82 snaps. A lot of guys played a lot of football. And just to put it in perspective, both of North Carolina's two linebackers played over 880 snaps last year. Cedric Gray, 880 snaps. Power Eccles, 899 snaps. That's like playing almost an entire additional season compared to what Florida State did last year. In terms of if you're Tatum Bethune or Kalen DeLoach. Tatum Bethune, under 500 snaps, and you compare that to 899 for Power Eccles. I mean, that's... And Florida State played an extra game. So... I mean, that tells you how well they manage the load in terms of depth. And that is something that they're going to continue to do this year. So that's really, really important across the board. And we'll keep seeing this. We'll keep using some of these comparisons to give you a sense of how Florida State, how much they're rotating relative to their competition. But this year, it's going to be interesting because without DeLoach, without Tatum Bethune, it's going to be just a completely different segment. And those two guys were really reliable the last 2 years. They were excellent last year. I mean, Bethune grew into an all-around linebacker. He was on the small side, about 210, 212 pounds most of the season. And then, Bethune, not quite as mobile, but a little bit more of the a little bit more of the between the tackles type, and again triggered so well and was so reliable in coverage. You think about the interception that he had in the ACC championship game that should have sealed them basically going to the college football playoff. Made some huge plays, clutch plays, and then you return Lundy, who was the third guy behind those two. You got a lot to replace. Now, the good thing is that DJ Lundy, despite initially transferring to Colorado, he came quickly back once he realized that the grass was definitely not greener out there in Boulder. Things are not as they seem from the outside. And he got out there and went, oh, shoot. It says something. I'll just say this. It says an awful lot that DJ Lundy and Omarion Cooper, Duke Cooper, are two players who transferred from Florida State to Colorado and then came back and said, yeah, that was a mistake. Think about what that does for recruiting moving forward. As, different players are looking at other places and you say, look, this guy here, he decided to go somewhere else. He decided to go where it might look a little bit better, but this is how good the culture is here, that guys left and realized, oh shoot, we'd rather come back. And the other thing is that it shows what kind of people and players they were, that the coaching staff welcomed them back and that the roster welcomed them back. It says a lot. In any case, one of those positions, DJ Lundy, is going to be your primary guy. No, he's been banged up a little bit, a little limited, but he's one of your primary guys there. For the most part, I don't have to spend a lot of time breaking down Lundy's game to everybody here. If you're listening to this podcast, you basically already know who he is. He was one of the best run defenders in not just in the ACC, but in the country. His Pro Football Focus run defense grade was 90.9, and it was deserved. Go back and watch the LSU game and take a look at where he is on certain plays and the impact that he had in that game. You can see what has happened in terms of Lundy, again, becoming an all-purpose backer. And this is where, look, I'm on record. I can't deny what I said when Randy Shannon was first hired. And that he would not have been my first or second or third choice for that position, for the linebacking coach position, largely because of recruiting and some other factors along those lines. But I got to say, one thing is clear. The guy can coach linebackers. You see linebackers consistently get better under him. And the linebackers he takes, he maximizes. DJ Lundy has gotten so much better than he was 3 years ago. He's no longer just in the tackles player, and when he is in between the tackles, he's that much better. He reacts better. He's in the right gap correctly, and in terms of matching and coverage and all of that, he's in the right spots. So there you've got a senior leader. He's going to be a guy who you're going to put the speaker in his helmet. You're going to let him be a guy that gets guys lined up. Huge value there. And again, a guy that played 400 plus snaps last year. Really all you're asking him to do is to add another 100 snaps or so this year, because you're hoping to rotate the same way that you did last year. Now, that's the guy that basically steps into Tatum Bethune's role. And I don't think there's a huge drop-off there. There was a drop-off, a little bit of a drop-off last year between the two. And, it wasn't enormous. And again, I think in this case, the Pro Football Focus grades are pretty accurate. The overall defensive grade last year for Bethune was 76. Overall for Lundy was 78.3. Basically a wash when one was on the field or the other. And I thought Bethune was a little bit better overall. I mean, that grade, that's within the margin of error. I would have had Bethune as a little bit more valuable overall on the season than Lundy, but Lundy was, it was not a significant drop off, if a drop off at all, when he came on the field instead of Bethune. So that tells you where you are there. Now, the other side, the harder guy to replace is Kalen DeLoach, who by all accounts is actually not only going to make the roster down in Tampa, but he's actually got a chance to be a legit 2-deep player, which, wow. As a rookie. And as a guy that, didn't get drafted highly and all of that, that shows what kind of player he actually is and was. So Florida State went out and initially they added Sean Murphy from Alabama as a guy to hopefully upgrade that position, former borderline 5-star player, 5-star recruit out of high school. I said this when Florida State first signed him, that I had some questions about him in terms of his being a football player and some of the lateral quickness and, in coverage stuff and how good a tackler he's going to be. I had some questions. I think those questions were kind of borne out in the spring. I think he's a guy that's going to need more time to develop. I don't think he's a bust or a guy that you give up on at this point. I think a lot of the athletic traits are there if he can continue to develop as a football player. And again, that's one thing Randy Shannon does great. So that's where you are. But I don't think Murphy came in and was actually an upgrade over the guys that they already had on the roster. I'll just put it that way. In fact, I think he basically wound up 4th out of that group, maybe 5th. You put Lundy, Nicholson, Cryer, Graham all over Murphy probably after the spring. So that didn't really solve that problem as a transfer coming in. But then they, after the spring, added Cam Riley, who had initially transferred from Auburn to NC State, and he decided NC State wasn't for him and decided that he'd made a mistake and decided to go to Florida State after the spring. So it's his second transfer in less than a year. And that's a guy, I had my questions about him were more about physicality. The strangest thing about Cam Riley is you pop in his Auburn reps and you look at his height weight, at his listed height weight on the roster, and you kind of do a double take. You go, he can't really be 6'4 plus 235, 240 pounds, can he? I actually kind of expected him to get to Florida State and wind up getting measured in and come in at like 6'3", 220, 225. But no, that dude is big. And the thing that stood out to me, again, my question marks on him in terms of the Auburn reps were, okay, I mean, he's super fluid. He kind of moves almost like a safety. But, how physical is he? How willing is he going to be to really mix it up? As far as I can tell, that question has been answered since he's been on campus. And again, you're looking at a guy with those movement skills and that wingspan and that weight. Cam Riley is going to be a difference maker for this defense, I think. I think he's one of the most important pickups that they got. This is going to be one of those guys that you point to at the end of the season and go, wow, that's a dude. And boy, it's a good thing he transferred in. Because essentially he serves as the bridge to the younger backers. And, it's too bad he didn't get in for the spring where he could be completely up to full speed defensively. But this is a guy who's been in 4 different defenses before this year. He's had multiple coordinators, 4 different coordinators, including the spring at NC State. He's learned a lot. And it's one of those things where if you learn one language, you can learn another. But if you learn a second language, it's easier to learn a third. And you learn a third language, it's easier to learn a fourth. Now, eventually there gets to be some confusion sometimes, some interference from one language to another. So you have to be mindful of that. But you do learn the ability to learn in some of those things. So that has expedited how quickly he's been able to catch up to speed here. But I think that's your other starter. And you're looking at 500 plus snaps from him. And he's a guy that, again, a lot of good reps in the SEC for Auburn, and a guy that brings in one thing that they're not going to have to deal with this year is, Kalen DeLoach, like I said, played last year a lot of the time at like 210. Riley is coming in 25 pounds heavier than that. He's going to play at 25 pounds heavier than that. And between the tackles, when he's coming up to fill, he's going to thump. So that's a plus. And you're not losing a bunch with him on the field in terms of coverage. He's in my opinion, more of a coverage backer than he is a thumper, despite the fact that he's 6'4 plus, 230, what I think he's listed at 237, probably play most of the season between, right around 235. So those are your two starters. And in terms of what you're looking at compared to last year, I think there's bound to be a little bit of a drop off just due to the experience level and some of the communication that comes with that. With Deloach and Bethune last year, and then you can kind of toss Lundy in as a third starter there. There was kind of a sense that when those guys were on the field, each hand knew what the other hand was always doing. I mean, there was a lot of really good communication. It's going to be hard to completely replicate that with these two now because you don't have guys that have played 2 full seasons together. And you got a guy who's new in the defense this fall. So there's probably going to be some unevenness, especially early in the season. You might expect a little bit, a play given up here or there that might not have been given up last year. But I do think that that the upside, the ceiling for Riley is higher than it was with either one last year. With either starter last year, in terms of that overall athletic upside for sure. And all indications are he's a smart player. He's going to be able to match and do all the things that they want him to do. And then you pair him with Lundy, and that you already know what you're getting there. I think your first two are pretty close. I think there's a small drop off from last year. Maybe a few splash plays that they can get, but I would say maybe a 10% drop off from last year in terms of overall production from those two guys and consistency from your first line guys. But here's the thing. Last year, your top two backers after Bethune and Deloach were Lundy and Omar Graham. Good players. Graham was never really fully healthy last year. Lundy was basically on the level of a third starter, so, you've got that. Interesting thing is that this year, they've got more depth. I think they're going to be able to rotate more quality bodies, and I think the second line guys are going to have better production and overall quality than what they had last year. So like I mentioned, Omar Graham last year was never really healthy, and the splits for him in terms of on-off field were not great last year. So defensive success rate without Graham on the field last year was 65.1%. Havoc rate, 22.1%. Yards per play, 4.9 yards per play. That's with him not on the field. With him on the field, there's a dip to 50.5% defensive success rate, 13.4% havoc rate, and 6.2 yards per play. That was a really, really big difference. And again, I want to emphasize he was a young player and never fully healthy, even coming out of camp. And so that was a major issue for them. They had 3 backers that they could really trust, for whom the splits were basically even. And then Graham he was never fully at the level that he wanted to be last year and that they needed him to be. So they didn't have really the fourth guy. This year, your third and your fourth guys are Justin Cryer behind DJ Lundy and Blake Nicholson behind Cam Riley. And Nicholson is a freak. He's one of those guys, 230 pounds, nice length at 6'3 plus. And again, another one of those guys that moves kind of like a safety. So now essentially with Nicholson, what you're hoping to get out of him before he graduates is essentially Kalen DeLoach plus 20 pounds and another inch or two. That's basically what you're looking at with him. He was raw coming in. He's pushing on Cam Riley. And frankly, he's a guy, Nicholson, I would be close to comfortable with him as a starter this year. Him as your third or fourth guy who's rotating in, getting 250, 300, maybe 300 plus snaps, depending on how many games you play. That's huge. Now you've got Riley playing first line minutes, Nicholson splitting with those. Then you got Justin Cryer behind DJ Lundy. And I think Cryer this year is pretty close to where Lundy was last year. So now you've got, last year, I think you had 4. I think you had 3 that you felt comfortable with that were really co-starters. This year, I think the starters are just a tick behind where they were last year, mostly due to experience. because they had two experienced guys and a third that was basically a co-starter. And this year you have one experienced guy and the other two haven't really been co-starters yet. So the experience gap is a little bit there. And I think you expect a little bit of a dip from those starters, but I think you've got higher quality in terms of the backups behind them. And then you add Omar Graham as your fifth guy, and a guy that's going to be a different player healthy after having some offseason work done and getting healthy. I think he's going to be significantly better than he was. So now you got a fifth guy that I think you're probably going to be able to trust. And then you get to Sean Murphy, who, again, high shelf talent, still learning to play the position. And that's before you even get to the freshmen. You still have DeMarco Ward on the roster. Tamir Hickman-Collins is a guy that stands out athletically. Jaden Parrish, another guy that, in just looking at some of the stuff from practice, I had to double take and kind of check my roster again and go, who is that? He really moves well. Those two young backers move really well, and I think there's a lot of promise there. So to me, this unit is pretty close. I mean, if I'm evaluating the whole unit in terms of what you can kind of expect going into the season, it's pretty close to parity from last year. I think, like I said, the starters just a tick behind, but the overall depth is better, and I think you can absorb more of the wear and tear of the season with this group than what you probably could have last year and what you did last year ultimately. I mean, you get a little nicked up on the inside. It's pretty easy at backer to get a little nicked up, and everybody kind of plays through something. But I think you've got at least 4, if not 5, if not 6 guys that are actually viable within your rotation. I think they narrow it mostly to 4, and, maybe a 5th guy gets in there some. But the great thing that enables them to do is I think they can basically have a bunch of guys with snap counts in the 400s out of this. You get 4 guys with more than 400 snaps on the season, and that enables you coming into the month of November and beyond to be way healthier than your opposition. And they're absolutely going to make use of that. I think that's a huge thing. It's going to be really interesting to see how they manage it. But I think you got to be very optimistic about this position group going into the season. All right, well, that'll do it for our linebacker position preview. We'll be back soon looking at another position group. I'm going to go ahead and batch these and release them much like I did on the offense. And see you again. Talk to you again tomorrow. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Louis Marquez of Keller Williams Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.